Story 1. The Architect of Shadows and the Illusion of the Vessel. The monk sat beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient banyan tree in the Jeddah Grove, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the rhythmic hum of cicadas that seemed to vibrate within the very marrow of his bones. His mind was a turbulent sea of gray silt, churning with the memory of a theft he had committed 20 years prior in a village far to the north. He recalled the precise texture of the grain he had taken from a widow's storehouse, the way the moonlight had cast long, accusing shadows across the dusty floor, and the cold knot of desperation that had tightened in his chest. This memory was not a distant ghost, but a living, breathing architect that constructed a prison of heavy silk around his heart every time he closed his eyes to meditate. He watched the Buddha walking slowly along the dirt path, each footfall deliberate and unburdened, as if the earth itself rose up to meet him in a gesture of mutual recognition. The monk felt a profound dissonance between his own internal weight and the luminous lightness of the teacher. He began to dissect the structure of his guilt, noticing how his intellect insisted on maintaining a bridge between the starving boy he had once been and the monastic seeker he had become. This bridge was built on the fallacious assumption of permanence, the belief that a singular, unchanging entity had traveled through time to occupy this present moment. He observed the movement of his thoughts and realized that the guilt was a form of vanity, a desperate attempt by the ego to claim ownership over a sequence of causes and conditions that had long since dissolved into the ether. If the cells of his body had died and been reborn 1,000 times, and if the hunger that drove the theft was a transient chemical fire, then who was the one currently suffering? He saw that he was clutching a handful of ash and weeping because it would not turn back into the wood that had burned 2 decades ago. The Buddha did not offer a word of absolution, for there was no one to forgive and no one to be forgiven in the vast, empty expanse of awareness. The monk noticed how his mind reflexively sought a judge, a cosmic authority to validate his penance. Yet the only judge was the law of cause and effect which operated in the immediate now. To carry the past was to create a new cause of suffering in the present, effectively poisoning the air he was currently breathing because of a storm that had passed half a lifetime ago. The internal machinery of his regret began to slow as he recognized that the seeker of liberation was the same fabrication as the perpetrator of the crime. There was only the rustle of the leaves, the cooling air of the evening, and the slow dissolution of the I that insisted on its own wretchedness. He felt the tightness in his sternum unravel like a frayed rope that had been holding a heavy anchor in the mud. The guilt was not removed by a divine hand, but by the empirical realization that its foundation was a phantom built of memory and linguistic labels. He sat until the sun dipped below the horizon, watching the shadows lengthen and eventually vanish into the unified darkness of the night. Understanding that light and shadow are not enemies but different expressions of the same emptiness. The burden of the past was revealed to be a conceptual ghost, a story told by a narrator who did not exist. And in that silence, the monk finally found the stillness he had chased for so many years. Story 2. The River of Unbelonging and the Weight of Silt. A woman stood upon the banks of the Ganges near the city of Rajgir, her eyes fixed on the swirling eddies that carried the debris of the monsoon rains toward the distant ocean. She was a widow of a high official, yet her fine silk robes felt like a shroud of lead because of the words she had failed to say to her husband before he perished in a sudden fever. The silence of those unuttered apologies had grown into a deafening roar within her mind, a relentless internal monologue that replayed the final hours of his life with agonizing precision. She believed that her current grief was a direct punishment from the heavens, a karmic debt that she would be forced to carry through 100 subsequent births. She observed a group of monks walking along the muddy shore, their orange robes appearing as bright sparks of fire against the gray backdrop of the river. Among them was the Buddha, whose presence seemed to anchor the very air around him, creating a pocket of stillness amidst the chaotic flow of the water. She watched how the river did not hesitate to absorb the filth of the city or the petals of the lotus, treating both with a profound and terrifying indifference. This observation triggered a shift in her contemplative state, leading her to question the nature of the continuity she so desperately maintained in her thoughts. She realized that her guilt was an attempt to freeze the river of her life, to pluck a single moment of failure out of the stream and hold it under a magnifying glass until it filled her entire field of vision. The Buddha paused and looked out at the horizon, his gaze suggesting an awareness that saw through the surface of things to the shifting atoms beneath. The woman began to understand that the her who had remained silent and the her who now suffered were not the same person, just as the water that touched the bank a moment ago was already miles away. Her suffering was rooted in the desire to control the past, an impossible craving that created a friction between what was and what she wished had been. She saw that karma was not a personal ledger of sins kept by a cosmic bookkeeper, but the natural momentum of mental habit. By dwelling on her guilt, she was merely reinforcing the habit of self-flagellation, ensuring that her future moments would be colored by the same darkness. The weight she felt was not the weight of her actions, but the weight of her attachment to a version of herself that no longer existed. As she watched a fallen branch get swept away by the current, she practiced the mental act of letting go of the narrator who insisted on her unworthiness. The internal noise began to subside, replaced by the empirical observation of the breath entering and leaving her lungs. She realized that the husband she mourned was also a flow of changing states, and that her silence was merely a single coordinate in a vast map of causes that neither of them could have fully governed. The guilt began to dissolve, not because she had been forgiven by a higher power, but because she had seen the transparency of the self that was pretending to be the owner of the guilt. The river continued its relentless journey, and for the first time in many years, she felt herself move with it rather than struggling against the tide. The knots of regret in her mind loosened as she acknowledged that the past is a graveyard of echoes and that life only exists in the precise flash of the present. She turned away from the water, her heart no longer a stone but a leaf, drifting light and unburdened upon the surface of the world. Story 3. The Monarch's Mirror and the Web of Causes. The king paced the marble terrace of the palace in Savatthi, his footsteps echoing like the rhythmic thumping of a heavy drum in a hollow, cavernous chamber that seemed to amplify every tremor of his soul. Below him, the sprawling city of the Kosala kingdom slept in a blanket of humid indigo and flickering torchlight. But his own mind was a chaotic theater of carnage where the ghosts of fallen soldiers marched in an endless, silent procession through the corridors of his memory. He looked at his hands in the pale moonlight, noting that they were physically clean and scented with the expensive sandalwood oils of his station. Yet in the deep theater of his consciousness, they remained perpetually stained with the dark, iron-scented blood of the border wars he had sanctioned to expand his dominion. This internal stain was not a physical reality but a persistent mental construct, a psychological residue that had calcified into a formidable wall between himself and the profound peace he observed in the wandering mendicants who frequented the city gates. He recalled seeing the Buddha sitting under the ancient sal trees in the Jetavana monastery, a figure of such radical stillness that he seemed to be the very axis around which the entire spinning world turned. The king began to investigate the intricate architecture of his remorse, noticing how his intellect insisted on viewing himself as the sole, autonomous author of every death that had occurred on the dusty battlefields of his youth. He saw that this belief was actually a form of supreme arrogance, a subtle refusal to acknowledge the vast, shimmering web of interdependence that governs all phenomena in the known universe. He began to trace the lineage of the war with a surgeon's precision, seeing how it was born from the ancient greed of his ancestors, the whispered fears of his ministers, the economic pressures of a failing harvest, and the collective movement of thousands of individual wills clashing in the dark. His guilt was the result of a narrow distorted lens that isolated one fragment of the infinite tapestry and labeled it with the heavy pronoun of mine. As he stood in the cooling night air, he observed the movement of his breath and the flickering of the distant oil lamps on the city walls. Realizing that the king who had ordered the war was a temporary collection of impulses and conditions that had already vanished into the absolute void of the past. The person standing on the terrace in this moment was a completely different configuration of matter, memory, and thought. Yet he was strangling his present vitality with the ghost of a man who no longer existed in any physical or spiritual sense. He saw that karma was not a moral punishment handed down by an external deity, but the natural, impersonal trajectory of energy moving through the medium of the human mind. By holding on to the guilt, he was not being a righteous ruler or making true amends. He was merely sustaining a state of internal violence that prevented him from acting with genuine clarity and compassion in the immediate now. The realization pierced through his ego like a blade of morning light, revealing that his suffering was an optional accessory he had chosen to wear along with his heavy crown and silk robes. He felt the chronic tension in his jaw and chest finally release as he stopped trying to resolve the unchangeable past and instead allowed it to be what it truly was, a series of causes that had already borne their bitter fruit and withered away. The ghosts on the battlefield did not require his perpetual misery to find their own peace. They were gone into the elements, and he was here in the silence. And the only relevant action was the quality of his awareness in this singular, unrepeatable moment of existence. He watched a small moth flutter toward a flickering lamp and understood that his guilt was like that moth, drawn to a flame of memory that offered no warmth and no light, only the potential for a slow and useless incineration of his potential for joy. The king let out a long, slow breath, watching the steam of it vanish into the silver moonlight. And for the first time in many difficult years, he felt the crushing weight of his history dissolve into the profound spacious emptiness of the night sky. This emptiness was not a lack of meaning, but a fullness of possibility. A clean slate where the ink of the past could no longer find a surface upon which to bleed into the purity of the present. He looked out over his kingdom and saw not a map of conquests, but a living organism of which he was merely a humble and temporary part. Story 4. The Merchant's Debt and the Dissolution of the Judge. The seeker sat in the dense shade of a massive teak tree on the outskirts of the village of Nalanda, his back pressed against the rough, unyielding bark that felt like a silent witness to the internal storm that had ravaged his peace for 10 years. Years ago, before he had donned the simple, saffron-stained robe of a forest traveler, he had been a prosperous merchant whose clever tongue and sharp, calculating mind had secured a great fortune at the direct expense of his closest childhood friend. He had watched with a cold, detached ambition as that friend lost his ancestral home, his family's dignity, and eventually his very life to the crushing despair of sudden poverty. All while the merchant had prospered in his house of stone and cedar, surrounded by the luxuries of his betrayal. Now, every time he closed his eyes to follow the subtle path of his breath in the silence of the woods, the face of his ruined friend appeared before him in the darkness, not with anger or accusations, but with a hollow, haunting emptiness that was far more devastating than any spoken curse. He felt that his entire spiritual practice was a fraudulent sham, a thin veil of performative piety draped over a rotting, hidden corpse of ancient betrayal that refused to stay buried in the earth. He observed the Buddha walking through the dappled light of the forest with a small group of disciples, noticing how the teacher's eyes seemed to hold the entirety of the horizon without clinging to a single point of preference or aversion. The seeker began to investigate the nature of the I that was currently feeling the heavy weight of the guilt, noticing how it was a self-constructed entity that thrived on the narrative of its own exceptional villainy. He realized that by holding on to his guilt with such ferocious intensity, he was maintaining a secret, perverse form of identification with his former life as a merchant, refusing to let that greedy version of himself die so that the seeker could truly be born into the light. This guilt was not a bridge to the past, but a heavy chain that anchored him to a fiction of continuity. He began to deconstruct the original event with a cold, analytical clarity, seeing how the fire of greed that had driven him was a series of impersonal impulses and chemical reactions, a temporary fever of the mind that had infected him like a seasonal virus. If a man in the throes of a violent delirium strikes another, is it the man who is the eternal enemy, or is it the fever that should be examined? He saw that his friend's tragedy was a tragic convergence of countless conditions: the merchant's greed, the friend's own financial choices, the harsh and indifferent laws of the kingdom, and the fickle nature of the marketplace. To claim the entire weight of that cosmic event for himself was a form of spiritual megalomania, a refusal to see the vast and indifferent machinery of the universe at work. He noticed how his mind actually preferred the sharp, familiar pain of guilt to the terrifying and boundless vastness of being nothing at all. The guilt provided a solid, reliable center, a point of reference that whispered, "I am a sinner," which was somehow more comfortable than admitting that the I was merely a shifting collection of temporary thoughts and sensations. He watched a line of black ants carrying a dead beetle across the dry forest floor, seeing the relentless cycle of nature consuming nature without the burden of a moral narrative or a judging ego. The Buddha's teachings on the nature of karma began to echo in the chambers of his mind, not as a system of divine punishment, but as a simple description of momentum and habit. To regret the past is to keep the momentum of the past alive and vibrating in the present moment. To let go is to stop the wheel from turning in that particular, painful direction through the sheer power of non-attachment. He realized that the only way to truly honor the memory of his friend was to become a source of clarity and compassion in the world now, rather than remaining a source of stagnant and useless misery. The internal courtroom, where he had been both the aggressive prosecutor and the cowering defendant for 10 years, finally fell silent. The bench is empty, and the judge vanished into the mist. There was only the sound of the wind in the teak leaves, the dry scent of the earth, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of spaciousness that felt like the sky opening up after a long, suffocating drought had finally broken. He understood that the past was a ghost and the future a dream, leaving only the vivid, pulsing reality of the breath as it entered and left his body in the great, indifferent silence of the forest. The friend he had betrayed was gone into the infinite, and the man he had been was gone as well, leaving only the quiet rustle of leaves in the evening air. Story 5. The Weaver of Regret and the Loom of Time. The woman sat in the doorway of her small hut on the outskirts of a village near the foothills of the Great Mountains, her hands resting idly upon a wooden loom that had remained silent for 3 full seasons. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the distant, cold breath of the snow-capped peaks. Yet her internal world was a stagnant pool of suffocating heat and thick, viscous shadows. Years ago, during a night of fierce winds and dry heat, she had left a single oil lamp burning while she rushed to aid a neighbor in labor. And that lone flame had birthed a conflagration that consumed 4 neighboring homes and left several families destitute. Since that hour, her mind had become a tireless weaver of a different sort, endlessly interlacing the threads of what if and if only into a heavy garment of guilt that she wore even in her shallow, fitful sleep. She watched the Buddha walking through the village square, his golden robe a stark contrast to the gray dust of the road, and she felt a sharp, agonizing envy for the way he moved as if he were a part of the wind itself. Her guilt was not merely a feeling but a rigid structure of the ego, a monument she had erected to her own perceived power to cause ruin. She began to observe the microscopic movements of her thoughts, noticing how her mind reflexively isolated her action from the infinite web of conditions that had allowed the fire to spread. She had ignored the dryness of the thatch, the unusual strength of the mountain gale, the absence of the village water carriers, and the sheer fragility of the wooden structures. Her guilt was built on the foundation of a simplified and false causality, a belief that she was the sole, omnipotent mover of events in a world that was actually a chaotic symphony of 1,000 shifting variables. She realized that her remorse was a form of vanity, a way of insisting that her small self was the center of the universe's tragedy. As she sat in the deepening twilight, she began to deconstruct the I that was supposedly responsible, seeing it as a flickering collection of impulses that had long since passed away into the void. The woman who had left the lamp burning was a ghost, a sequence of mental states that no longer existed in the present reality. Yet she was sacrificing her current life to appease a phantom. The Buddha's silent presence suggested that there is no ledger in the stars, only the immediate quality of the mind as it meets the present moment. To carry the fire within her heart for 3 years was to continue burning the village every single day in the theater of her own consciousness. She saw that true atonement was not the cultivation of misery, but the cultivation of a clear, unburdened awareness that could finally be of use to the living. The heavy silk of her regret began to unravel as she acknowledged that the past is not a solid stone, but a river of mist. She felt the tension in her throat and shoulders dissolve, replaced by a cool, spacious neutrality that allowed her to see the village not as a site of her failure, but as a field of present needs. The loom in front of her seemed to pulse with a new possibility use, no longer a reminder of her neglect, but a tool for a new and mindful creation. She understood that she could never unburn what had been lost, but she could stop the fire of her own making that was currently consuming her soul. The silence of the mountain evening became a sanctuary rather than a prison, and she breathed in the cold air with a sense of profound, empirical liberation. The guilt was not deleted by a word of grace, but by the surgical realization that its owner was a fiction of the mind. Story 6: The Hunter's Silence and the Void of the Arrow. An elderly man who had spent 40 years as a hunter for the royal court sat upon a jagged outcrop of rock overlooking the valley of Rajgir. His weathered face a map of deep furrows and scars earned from a lifetime of chasing the fleet-footed deer and the powerful tiger. His hands, now gnarled like the roots of an ancient cedar, trembled slightly as he recalled the thousands of arrows he had loosed into the soft flesh of living creatures. The memory of every dying eye he had ever looked into was etched into the inner lining of his eyelids, creating a gallery of silent, accusing witnesses that made the stillness of meditation feel like a descent into a charnel ground. He felt that he was a vessel filled with a dark, heavy ink that could never be washed clean, a man whose very essence was saturated with the karma of the kill. He observed the Buddha sitting in a nearby cave, a figure of such profound and crystalline purity that the hunter felt his own presence was a stain upon the earth. He began to analyze the structure of his self-loathing, noticing how his mind treated his past actions as if they were permanent, solid objects that he was forced to carry in a heavy sack upon his back. He realized that his guilt was based on the assumption that there was a singular, unchanging hunter who had traveled from the first kill to this final moment of reflection. Yet, as he watched the clouds shift and dissolve over the valley, he saw that the man who had loosed the arrows was a different configuration of desire, instinct, insight, and ignorance than the man who now sat in contemplation. The guilt was a tether to a corpse, a refusal to accept the fundamental law of change that governed every atom of his being. He began to practice a radical form of equanimity, observing the memories of the hunts without the secondary layer of the judging ego that labeled them as the sins of a monster. He saw that the hunter had been a product of his time, his caste, and the survival instincts of his ancestors, a cog in a vast and indifferent biological machine. To hate himself was merely to add another layer of violence to the world, a mental violence that was just as destructive as the physical arrows of his youth. He noticed how the Buddha did not look at him with pity or condemnation, but with an awareness that saw only the play of light and shadow. The hunter realized that the animals he had killed had long since returned to the elements. Their suffering ended in the very moment of their passing, while he was the only one keeping the pain alive through the repetitive cycle of his own thoughts. He understood that karma was not a moral debt that could be paid with misery, but a pattern of energy that could only be broken by the cessation of the identity that sustained it. As he sat in the deepening purple of the twilight, he allowed the image of the judge and the prisoner to dissolve into the empty air of the mountain. He felt the heavy sack of his past slip from his shoulders and tumble into the abyss of the valley, not because he had forgotten his deeds, but because he had stopped using them to construct a wall of separation between himself and the infinite. The silence of the forest was no longer filled with the cries of the wounded, but with the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the living earth. He saw that he was neither the hunter nor the saint, but the vast, open space in which both concepts could appear and vanish like ripples on a pond. The weight of 40 years of killing evaporated in the heat of a single clear insight into the non-existence of the doer. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the darkness behind his lids was not a gallery of ghosts, but a wide, peaceful ocean of light. The hunter had finally laid down his bow, and in the silence that followed, he found the only peace that is not subject to the tides of time,